So, good evening, and then thank you so much for coming for my lecture today. I think the opportunity to be here in a very high esteem. And I'm thankful to Laura for initiating this program. And also appreciate all the colleagues who have been very welcoming for the past 6 months that I've been here. I don't want to mention names because in case I forget some names, I'll be in trouble. But I want to say that I'm really thankful for the collegiality that I've received since I've been here. Laura has said a lot, and today, and without much ado, I want to talk about a topic that I think is very significant in these global discourses about urbanization, climate change, and sustainability. And as Laura said, the special focus of my work centers on the global south. I'm particularly interested in the global south because I think that it is not possible to achieve sustainable development if it is not linked to cities, communities, and societies that appear to be behind in terms of developmental discourses. And we could frame this in the context of global equity, global justice. But before I zoom into the lecture today, Laura has said a bit about me, but I would want to kind of streamline my background a bit. I think this is an opportunity for possible crisscrossing discipline and discussions and possible future collaboration. So permit me in the next 1 or 2 slides to introduce myself in more, in a way that suits the way I frame my work. And so my background is in urban and development planning. Development planning basically means the intersections of developmental issues and planning as framed within international development. As Laura said, I received my initial training in Western Africa, and then I moved on to Italy and to Germany, and I spent some time in Sweden for my postgraduate studies. I spent some time in the European Union and working on social innovation in European cities across 5 cities. From there, I moved on to Japan, where I worked in the field of international planning and development, particularly in Southeast Asia, but centered in Japan. My goal as a professional planner is to contribute to pathways that respond to intersecting developmental problems in the urban south. And I use intersection here in a more intentional way. I understand that there are different ways that we respond to the challenges we face in the urban south and the global north. But I think that most of the challenges we face have intersectional values. And so we cannot separate issues of gender from issues of economic disparity. In the same way, we cannot also separate economic disparity from access to services and facilities. So I think intersectional framing is very important to my work. And the catalog of the work that I have done kind of transitions across these themes, still reflecting on the issue of intersectionality. And this is conditioned within the discourse of equity and resilience. And a few months ago, I talked about the issue of work and social equity, which reflects that aspect of my work. And today I will talk about the issue of resilience, bringing together these important things around what I do. And in terms of my teaching, I focus on 2 main issues. One is innovation, and I frame innovation in this particular context, not in terms of the way it is framed in Western discourses of technology or smart services, but innovation in the sense that we build on what local people are doing, especially in marginalized indigenous communities, to improve services in a way that respond to the challenges, back to intersectionality, that communities face. And the last aspect of it is empathy. I believe that in the current discourses about urban development, we need to frame what we do around empathy. How do we position ourselves in the people we plan for? How do we feel what they feel? So this memorialization and these processes of placing ourselves in terms of our agents in the places and the people we plan for are very significant. And so with this, I want to kind of frame what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm going to start about the premise of my lecture today, which is what I refer to as the local consensus on climate change impact and resilience planning. I use local consensus as a way of the convergence between global, national, and local issues in terms of climate change and resilience planning. And the second part of my presentation, I will talk about the challenge of global inequities in terms of climate change impact and resilience capacities, which I refer to as the global north-south divide. And in the third part, I want to zoom into more context, framing this work within the context of the Philippines. And I will later on illustrate why the Philippines provide a very fertile ground to situate this discourse around urban resilience and climate change. And the third part, I would introduce an approach I refer to hermeneutics, borrowing from recent discourses in theological studies about textual analysis and how we can understand what we planners and designers do just by reading text or by understanding text. And third, and then fifth, I will talk about emerging issues, implications, and finally I will end with the implications of my presentation for CAPLA. And so, the New Urban Agenda, I don't know whether we are familiar with the New Urban Agenda, but in 2016, the UN Habitat introduced a momentous document referred to as the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda and the recently introduced the World Cities Report places emphasis on the role of cities and local government in adopting and implementing plans and strategies that address disaster vulnerabilities. So the whole focus of the New Urban Agenda and the World Cities Report is the idea that if you want to transition to resilient cities, sustainable cities, we need to be emphasizing the capacity of local and municipalities and cities to be able to prepare plans. And this reinforces very serious conviction of Ban Ki-moon when he was president of the United Nations that the battle for climate would be lost or won in cities. So this is a real wording of what Ban Ki-moon had said before he left the position as the leader of the UN. And also, we are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is referred to in the UN context as the UN Agenda 2030. And the UN Agenda 2020 also stresses the importance of increasing the number of local governments adopting and implementing resilience plans to place communities on safe, inclusive resilience trajectories, specifically the SDG 11.1b. And thirdly, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction also calls for holistic planning that builds resilience capacities at all levels, especially in cities. And to bring this within the US context, the American Planning Association president last year also re-echoed this, that global communities, national policies, and local planning must all work together in confronting and combating climate change and its impact on people. And if you take it from the US context, even to the University of Arizona, the Strategic Initiative of the University of Arizona on Grand Challenges also stresses resilient communities and societies. And so the point I want to put across here is that we can see this kind of flow of convergence from the global, the national, and the local context. This convergence that we need to be building resilience capacities at the local level. However, the fact that we need to build resilience capacities at the local level does not imply that these capacities are equally distributed across geography. And so the vulnerability conditions that necessitate local resilience planning are not equally distributed. And last year, in the international report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, echoed this strongly, that cities in the global south contribute the least to climate change, but face the worst impact of climate change. So right from the onset, we see this global inequity and injustice in terms of climate change risk distribution and capacities. However, we also, as I've already stressed, that planning capacities are very important. But we do know that even though global south cities are facing the worst impact of climate change, be it flooding, drought, or what have you, they have the least capacity to respond to climate change. And so this generates cascading effects on the issues in terms of socioeconomic and climate vulnerabilities in the global south. And this is not new. So what I'm saying is not anything that is new. I mean, in the scholarly discourses. But what has happened in the last few years in terms of international development planning is the fact that there has been a new institutionalization of international development in terms of resilient capacities in the global south. So what is happening is that this recognition that cities in the global south are facing extreme climate change impacts, but they don't have the capacity to respond to this, has led to the, international development organizations develop new frameworks that allow cities in the global south to develop new guidelines that empower their people or their planners to be able to respond to this challenge. But is this enough? Is it okay to say that United Nations or different organizations from the global north or other in the UN ecosystem developing these new guidelines, are they enough to empower cities in the global south to be able to respond to these challenges? And this is the point of departure for my lecture today. And so I think that this new international development planning framework that seeks to champion resilient planning in the global south needs to be problematized. And I think that there are 4 key ways that we can problematize this issue. First is the idea that the overemphasis on large metropolitan regions in the urban south, despite the fragmentation in the institutional planning process. And here I want to refer to the idea of mega cities. So this is a terminology that has taken, hold in international planning over the past 10 years. Mega cities are cities of more than 10 million people. There's been a focus on mega city planning in terms of resilience in the global south. But the reality of many cities in the global south is that there is fragmentation. So even though you have this metropolitanization in the global south, actually there are smaller cities that are dealing with the harsh effects of climate change, especially as considered in resilient capacities. The second point I want to emphasize is the fact that the critical nodes of socio-environmental vulnerabilities inevitably manifest in smaller cities. I'll come to this later on. Third is the fact that top-down capacity building programs for resilience often focus on planned outputs, but not planned content. And so the idea is that we should encourage cities in the global south to prepare plans, what we refer to as resilient plans. And so if a local authority or a local planning agency is able to produce a plan, that is the first step in the capacity building process. But I want to argue that perhaps we should move beyond just preparing plans to interrogate the content of the plans and ask, are these plans mainstreaming the major or important attributes of climate resilience? And so I think that this is very critical because for us in the planning field, we know that plans are blueprints that guide development. And so if the blueprints or the content of the plans, if they are weak, the interventions are going to be weak. So we need to be thinking about the capacity of cities in the global south to be able to prepare plans that show intentionality and directionalities that integrate these important resilience attributes in terms of fostering resilience capacity. And so the key issue for me that I want to draw, out there in this particular lecture are 2. The first point is the fact that our rapidly urbanizing global south cities facing climate change impacts mainstream about resilience in the local prepared plans. So I'm taking a step further beyond the UN framing of preparing plans to the content of the plans. What is in these plans? And are these plans resilient in terms of their framing? And second, what are the implications of the strength, the gaps, and the weaknesses in these plans for directionalities and intentionalities in building resilience to climate change impacts in global south cities? And so having understood this, 3 critical points. The fact that there is a global convergence, global national local convergence about the need to build capacity at the local level. First point. Second point, the idea that there is global inequity in the vulnerability and the impact of climate change in the global south. And 3, the fact that we cannot just focus on preparing plans, but we need to think about the content of the plans leads us into the context of Manila. And so, the Philippines is an island nation situated across along the Pacific Ring of Fire. When I use the word the Pacific Ring of Fire, I'm referring to countries such as Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and what have you. They are referred to as the Pacific Ring of Fire because their geographical location exposes them to a number of very critical environmental hazards, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and what have you. Secondly, the Philippines is exposed to a plethora of natural hazards such as earthquakes, storms, and volcanic eruptions, and what have you. In fact, according to the MDAT, which is the International Database of Disaster Occurrences across the world, between 1900 and 2002, there were 549 disaster events in the Philippines. And I want us to just look at this particular table at the top end of this slide. That within this period, if you take, a disaster like flooding, more than 33 million people in the Philippines have been affected by flooding. And the cost in terms of damage in US dollars is more than 3.8 million. And this is in the context of a developing country. So it means a lot. The numbers mean it's a lot. If you take a different, hazard, for example, like earthquakes, which have, killed more than 9,000 people, and also affected 6.5 million people, and economic damage of more than $600,000. So we are talking about a very extreme event that will run on necessitated resilient capacities and global South context. And thirdly, I want to emphasize that more than 82% of all these disaster events are hydrometeorological in nature. So I'm referring to flooding and related. And then if we zoom into Metro Manila, which is referred to as the national capital region of the Philippines, it's a mega city of 13.4 million people, which faces a multiple spectrum of disaster risks. In fact, building resilience in Metro Manila is an imperative because of the increasing frequency in intensity of climate change events. And I want to just touch on these three maps here. So the first is flood susceptibility. And here you could see that almost the entire region of Metro Manila has a level of vulnerability to flooding, even though the scale is not the same across. And if you look at the ground shaking susceptibility, this also, towards the east and the west, is also very pronounced. And then tsunami along the coast. And so we are talking about, if we move beyond metropolitan Manila into the different cities, these pronounced vulnerability to different forms of disaster, re-echoing or warranting this issue about building resilience capacities at the local level to face current and future risks. And so having, this as the base of understanding the disaster risk context of the Philippines, what I decided to do in this particular way that I did just 2 years ago was to kind of frame resilience around the United Nations postulation of what resilience is. I did this for two reasons. One is the fact that most global South cities actually prepare their resilience plan following the UN guidelines. And so this, it doesn't necessarily mean that the UN guidelines are the best, but they receive funding and capacity building programs by following these guidelines. And so if we want to assess resilient capacities, we need to place the resilient plans within this framework, because this is what they are using to build their resilience plans. This is number one. The second aspect of it is that a lot of the flows in terms of knowledge, planning knowledge for doing these things, comes from the UN and other international organizations that champion these processes. And so what is the UN Resilient Planning Framework? It is known as the Making Cities Resilient Framework, MCR 2030. And there are 10 main attributes in this resilient framework. One is governance, risk identification, financial considerations, urban development, ecosystem protection, institutional capacity, social capacity, infrastructure, preparedness, and response. The idea is that these different aspects of resilience are holistic enough for cities in the global south to be able to capture these elements and integrate them into their plans as the first step in building their capacity to respond to current and future risks. But it doesn't end there. Each of the components of resilience have sub-criteria that are clearly defined by the UN. And so, for example, if you look at governance, there is a focus on multi-sectoral relationships in terms of the relationship between private, civil society, and other related organizations. In terms of risk identification, there is also this focus about hazard mapping, being able to use more recent technologies to be able to map risk across geographies. There is also the issue about financial considerations. And here I want to emphasize something that I think is very interesting in this framing, the idea of contingency funding, that this city don't have to develop on federal or subventions from higher authorities, but the ability for them to have stipulated funds in case of emergency to draw on for disaster risks. And in terms of urban development, building code standards, standardization that allows cities to guide new physical development that is resilient. Thinking through this, it appears that this framework, it's quite encompassing, holistic enough to be able to help cities in the global south, especially in the context of Philippines, to be able to harness this tool and be able to prepare plans that address their needs. However, my problematization is this. All these cities in Metro Manila, 17 cities have prepared these plans. And by preparing these plans, they have achieved the goal of the UNDDR that they are supposed to prepare plans. My question is, what is in these plans? And are these plans capturing the main essentials of resilience? And to do this, I adopt a certain methodology that comes from theological studies. It's referred to as textual analysis. Reading text and trying to understand what is the meaning of a particular text. How is a text used? In other words, in planning, parlance, we refer to this as plan content analysis or quantitative thematic coding. And so to apply this hermeneutic method or thematic coding method, I pick all the prepared plans, so-called resilient plans, for all the local cities in the Philippines. There are 70 of them in the Philippines, and 11 of them cooperated with our work. And so I picked the 11 that were very cooperative in the work, leaving out the 6. And so these are the 11 cities that were picked, and these are the plans that we use to assess the content, trying to understand the use of resilience attributes in these plans. And to do this, I mentioned that we use hermeneutic method for understanding text, thematic content analysis. So what we're doing is that for every plan that we picked, we use a criterion to understand the way the wording in these plans were framed, the use of the resilient attributes in these plans. And so, for example, just to show an example here, so this is the scoring, the output that came from this process. And this was done with the municipal planners. So this is not us imposing our definition understanding of the text on the planners. This was done with the planners, and there were 2 planners from each of the cities. So first, we try to ask, are the resilient attributes mentioned in these plans, first of all? And if they were mentioned, we move on to the second step. Are they mentioned with detailed elaborations for us to be able to ascertain their significance? At what level of significance? And so based on this, we adopt a particular rating that has been developed by the American Planning Association based on the work of Goodall and Ross on this rating about 0 to 50% viewpoint integration, weak integration, and strong integration. So if a city plan has 80 to 100% integration, we believe that it is adopting the resilient language more pervasively. And it goes on in descending order. And so this is the radar chart that shows the integration of the different resilient attributes across the 11 cities that we evaluated. And I want to pick on 2 just to push across this idea of preparing plans without understanding the content of the plans. And so if you look at Caloocan City, for example, which is a very highly susceptible city in the Philippines, in terms of risk identification as a component of urban resilience framing, it scores really highly, almost 100%. But across all the other major attributes of resilience, it performs very badly. And this is quite surprising because you would expect that the cities that have high vulnerability to climate change impacts such as flooding would assert high relevance of urban resilience attributes. I'll come to the reasons later. And if you compare to a city like McCarthy City, which appears to be performing significantly well across all the different urban resilience attributes. So the key point here is that we do not find anything uniform in terms of performance across the cities. There is a sporadic, or perhaps I should say that the performance is not uniformly distributed across the cities. And there should be underlying reasons for why this is happening. And this is very important in terms of resilience building. And so in the next three slides, I'm going to look at the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities. Which areas are the cities doing better in terms of resilience framing? And which areas are they not doing so well? And what are the issues that appear to be missing in this plan's framing of resilience? And so in terms of strength, there are 6 key aspects of resilience that we found that the cities appear to be performing better in terms of the plan context. One was governance. The cities appear to understand the role of governance in resilience planning. But I must emphasize that the reason why they were performing better in terms of framing their plans across resilience was because there was a guideline from the federal authority. And so they were mainly following the guideline from the federal authority. And second was risk identification. What was also very interesting is the fact that most of the cities were making use of new technologies to map risk, which I think that it's something that should be leveraged in terms of building resilience capacities in a global south context. There were financial considerations, which most of the cities were aware that finance is very important in terms of responding to risk, and they were planning towards the social capacity, preparation and response, and infrastructure protection. That they asserted, they identified this issue, but they did not clearly articulate how they were going to do this in the plan. And here we have too many issues I want to talk about. And for us as planners, this is very important to build environment professionals, urban development. So you have this resilient, so-called resilient plans that have been prepared, but the articulation of resilient urban development is very weak. And the key, cause for this is that resilient land use zoning or risk adapted building standardization were not very clearly articulated in the plans. This is a major setback. And then institutional capacity, the role of institutions, clearly articulating what institutions, the roles that institutions were supposed to take in implementing these plans were not also very clear. And then what are the gaps? The gaps here refer to things that were clearly not mentioned in the plans. The important resilience attributes, but they don't appear in the plans at all. And the first is ecosystem protection. This was alarmingly striking for me. Because of the discourse in the last 5 years of nature-based solutions. In the last 5 years, nature-based solutions have taken on one of the important frontiers in terms of sociological approaches to resilience building in the global south. But none of the cities, except McCarthy City, makes this point in the plan. So it comes across as if that ecosystem protection has nothing to do with resilience in the context of the plans. So if you're looking at just the plan output, we may say that, oh, they have prepared the plans and they are on the path to resilience. But the content shows that the advantage of ecological resources are not very clearly articulated. The second point I want to mention is that in the context of Manila, where disaster risk is a perennial problem, every year there's some sort of flooding, or in one way or the other. But the engagement of disaster victims in the resilience planning process is not articulated. This is a major setback as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is that you have 17 cities in a metropolitan area that is a mega city, all facing a similar issue of drought, flooding, and earthquake. But there is no city planning among the municipalities. So you have different cities facing the same issue, but you're not talking to each other. And so beyond this, we try to engage the planners and the institutions, their perspective on why the plans were, the outcome of the plans were coming as this. Why were there, weaknesses and gaps in the framing of resilience in the global south? In the context of Manila, I'm sorry. And these 3 points, I think that these are important messages from this work that I will want to, dwell on because they are very significant in the way international development systems work. First point I want to talk about, and these are quotes. So even though I picked these 3 key points, I wanted to support this with quotes verbatim by the planners and institutions that were captured during this work. And the first point I want to talk about is what I referred to as knowledge asymmetries. And here, the planner for one, of the cities makes this poignant point that I'm a planner and a local citizen, but then international organizations come with experts from developed countries to organize workshops and programs to teach us resilience, as if we have nothing to bring to the table, no agency. They bring their frameworks and teachings to apply. And this shows how the global flow of knowledge and then the underlying principles of power permeate the way resilient planning works. That these folks who have been living here for so many years and have dealt with different forms of rates are treated as if they have no agency. They bring nothing to the table in terms of the way resilient planning occurs. And this is a major gulf between the way things are conceived in the north and the way things work in the south. The second point I want to emphasize is what I refer to as siloed institutional structure, which basically brings, this theme of these 17 municipalities dealing with the same issue but not talking to each other. So this fragmentation of resilience planning without collaboration and cooperation. And so this community development officer makes, I think, a very important point that they are duplicating resources. They are duplicating efforts with limited resources. So in research-constrained environment, this is also a very significant point. And the last I want to talk about, which I think is very important for us here, what we do at CAPLA, is planning capacity. And here, this CEO's representative makes this issue that small cities do not have planners well trained in issues of resilience, climate change, or even the role of ecological resources. So they just follow national and regional guidelines without critical evaluation of their context, contextualization, and adaptation of guidelines in their context. And I think that this is also very important in terms of how we train the students who come through the walls of our institution to be able to go back and to champion new paradigms and to champion new methods and ways of doing things that bring innovative changes to their own environment. And so from this, I want to look at the implications of these issues for planning and policy before I think for CAPLA. And so there are 4 main things I want to emphasize here in terms of implication for planning and policy. And the first is the need for intercity planning platforms. You see, metropolitan governance in recent discourses have gained traction in the global south. And the idea of metropolitan governance is supposed to be able to bring cities together to be able to pool resources, exchanges knowledge, and to build collective capacities to be able to deal with common problems. And so intercity learning platforms, I think that is something that should be championed significantly. If cities that are facing extreme impact of climate change lack the ability to do so, they might learn from cities that are doing it better in terms of dealing with climate change such as disaster. The next point I want to talk about is to take advantage of these recent discourses around nature-based solutions. In fact, last year, the World Bank produced a very insightful report about a catalog of nature-based solutions across the globe. how communities, especially indigenous communities, were building on their many years of living with nature to inform different practices around ecology. And I think that these, new, momentum around ecology and nature could be harnessed in the global south as an environmental co-benefit approach to the resilience planning. The third point I want to also emphasize is the idea of this procedural equity. And when I use procedural equity, I'm referring to the processes and the mechanisms that allow citizens, especially those being affected by disaster, to become part of the design of resilience planning post-disaster. And as I said earlier, one of the weaknesses in Metro Manila is the fact that disaster victims are not part of the resilient planning processes. And this is an equity problem that needs to be dealt with from an equity perspective, procedural equity to be specific, in terms of this memory practices and knowledge and the experiences of disaster victims become part of the resilient planning processes. And the last is the idea of building planners' capacity in terms of this knowledge of resilience, integrating resilience, mainstreaming resilience, and resilience for both material and immaterial processes. But I think that it would be kind of a job not well done if I would finish this presentation without teasing out the implications for the work that we do here at CAPLA. And so I want to emphasize some key issues about how these, emerging issues about resilience planning in Metro Manila, kind of the ramifications of this to our pedagogical and our partnerships here that we strike at CAPLA. And the first I want to talk about is pedagogy. And so a few days ago, the dean brought up this issue about increasing number of international students in CAPLA, which is fantastic. But I think that we need to take the conversation further and to, as we bring these new international students in, to introduce a range of methodologies that allow international and indigenous students to be able to contextualize new learnings in diverse urban contexts, so that when these students are going back to their local context, they have tools that they can adapt in their places and spaces to champion new approaches and paradigms for resilient futures. So this idea of community-based learning, this idea of adaptive methodologies that allow students to be able to situate what we teach them within their own context, bringing international examples, bringing examples from the global south, bringing examples that are beyond the West, but are innovative in the way that people are dealing with resilient issues in the south. The next issue I want to talk about is the idea of decolonization. And so I've talked about the issue of a global south, but whenever we talk about the global south, the idea is that a group of people that need to be helped. And I've put across this idea that even when you look at the resilient planning processes in Metro Manila, it is sort of about there are areas that they are doing well, and there are areas that they are not doing well. So how does it inform the kind of collaborations we do in terms of international partnerships? And I think that this needs to be decolonized in terms of seeing partnerships between the North and the South as not the way international development works. That power and knowledge flows from a certain developed context to a developing context. I think we need to look at it from a bi-directional perspective in terms of what each other brings to the table in shaping the work that we do and to foster resilient futures in terms of our training of the students here and the partnership we strike with different universities and different institutions, whether in Latin America or elsewhere. The third point I want to emphasize is that if we want to deal with global inequities and resilience in terms of cities that are in the global south facing extreme climate change impacts, but are less prepared or less capable to be able to deal with these challenges, then we need to be capturing the next generation of talented students coming from these areas as our agents of change. And CAPLA believes in change. And so to kind of challenge new students and then give them these capabilities and the capacities to be able to go back to their places of abode and champion new models of building resilience. And I think that this is a work that CAPLA has done fantastic, but to push forward in terms of financial incentives for attracting students from this context. And then the last that I want to talk about is that perhaps I could be bold to say that beyond the global south, we could go further to look at our district of Arizona, indigenous communities, vulnerable communities that are around us. How do we localize this resilience agenda? And that is coming from the UN, that is coming from these organizations. This global discourse about sustainability, climate change, and resilience, how do we bring it in terms of vulnerable communities, indigenous communities, within our own backyard? And I think that this could be through active partnership with representative organizations, social enterprises, and all that. And I say kudos to the Drachman Institute and to all the faculty here and the wonderful work that they've been doing in terms of partnership with different communities and different agencies here. But I still want to push across with the idea that this work that we are doing allows us to continue framing within the work that I have actually presented now, that indigenous communities and other places that are at risk of climate change impact need more of our active partnerships to be able to concretize new co-production experimental initiatives to build resilience. And so this is basically my message today, and I hope that my message has been cut across very clear. But to end, I want to express gratitude because rarely would anyone raise any point without the support of a few other people. And so most of you might be seeing me for the first time or seeing my work for the first time. But I want to say that there are several agencies that support my work since my PhD for the 5 years that I've been assistant professor. And I want to acknowledge all these people and colleagues in different countries that have been very supportive of the work that I've done. Charles Darwin University, Osaka University, University of Memphis, University College London, and then the institution that funded my work, Panasonic, ESPS, and Google. Thank you very much.